So this video is the second one on our topic of stereotypes, prejudice and discrimination. And in this episode, I want to talk less about what psychology has said about those three social processes, but more about what it's done. And I'm not talking about done in terms of research or practice to combat these negative social processes, but done in the sense of how psychology has negatively stereotyped certain groups, how it's treated certain groups prejudicially, and how it's discriminated against certain groups. And we're going to focus on one group based on gender, a social group of women. What has psychology said about and done to women? It's been reasonably argued that women have largely been erased from much of the history of psychology in terms of noting the contribution made by female psychologists. And this happens in a lot of areas of work. And that's why history is sometimes referred to as his story. And the history students are presented with when it comes to psychology's development has largely been his story. And this was a voice concerned by Bowen, who said in 1990 that women's concerns and individual women have been invisible in the field of psychology. When you study the history of psychology, you mainly learn about the founding fathers. Ivan Pavlov, John Watson, William James, B.F. Skinner, Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Jean Piaget, and so on. They're all men. Have you noticed that? They're all men, all white men. But there were many women who played a significant part in the history of psychology, but they've been airbrushed out of our history. Mary Whitton Culkins, Mary Ainsworth, Letta Stetter Hollingworth, Karen Horney, Mamie Phipps Clark, Christine Ladd Franklin, Margaret Floyd Washburn, Eleanor Maccabi, Anna Freud. Have you heard of any of them? Heard of any of those women? They all played a major role in the development of psychology, but most psychologists have never heard of them. But when I got to that last name, maybe you went, yes, I've heard of her, Anna Freud. So not all women have been erased from psychology's history. But remember, you probably only know about Anna because of her father, Sigmund Freud. And Harry Muston and Marich, in 1990, they pointed out the following ways that women psychologists become invisible in psychology. So did you know that Terman scales, these are the scales of masculinity and femininity that were developed by Lewis Terman and Carolyn Miles, but Carolyn's name got dropped. Murray's thematic apperception test, can't say it, couldn't pass it. Murray's thematic apperception, TAT. The TAT is how we know it. For obvious reasons, we can't pronounce it, or I can't. Do you know, that wasn't developed by Henry Murray on his own. He developed it with Christiana Morgan, but her name got dropped. And Erikson's life cycle theory, that was actually developed jointly by Eric and Joan Erikson, but only Eric's name is listed as the author. And women have been kind of erased like that in psychology. But it doesn't mean that psychology has completely ignored women. Oh no, it's had plenty to say about women. And you might be surprised at some of this. So here are our founding fathers. Sir Granville Stanley Hall. He helped establish experimental laboratories in psychology and is described as the founder of clinical psychology and educational psychology. He's also the first president of the American Psychological Association, which was back in 1892. He said that education could threaten women's fertility. Herbert Spencer, he wrote Principles of Psychology, 1855, and was hugely influential in psychology in regards to establishing the application of evolutionary theory to psychology. He said women's brains are less evolved than men's, and women's intellectual skills therefore more primitive. James Cattell, another major figure in psychology, who's a specialist in individual differences and psychometrics, he attributed a declining birth rate directly to the expansion of education for women. Again, that idea that education threatened women's fertility. He opposed women academics getting promoted to professional ranks. Hugo Munsterberg, he was the pioneer of applied psychology in clinical, industrial and forensic settings. He said women shouldn't be allowed to serve on juries because they were not capable of thinking rationally. Edward Titchener, he was a specialist in structure of the mind. He studied introspection and empathy. Turns out, may not have been awfully emphatic towards women. He banned women from his Society of Experimental Psychologists. And finally, and perhaps the most famous of them all, Sigmund Freud. He said, nature has determined women's destiny through beauty, charm and sweetness. Law and custom have much to give women that has been withheld from them, but the position of women will surely be what it is. In youth, an adored darling, and in mature years, a loved wife. Sweet, but misogynist. Now, of course, these are the views that were commonly held in society at that time in the West. Western society was highly patriarchal. People didn't think women should be given the vote. Lots of women were barred from positions of authority. So what these psychologists were saying about women back then was reflective of the social conditions experienced by women. And they were views that were common among intellectual circles outside of psychology. It wasn't just in psychology. So there were psychologists saying this stuff, but there were other scientists saying this stuff. Charles Darwin, he stated that the chief distinction between men and women was that men had higher intellectual powers, which showed itself in the fact that men achieved more than women. And in medicine, Edward Clarke of Harvard Medical School wrote the book Sex and Education. He said that women should not receive equal education to men, as that would be a crime against nature. Grant Allen, a biologist, a novelist, went so far as to say women merely reproduced, men were the ones that were truly human. So this is part of our history in science, as well as our history in psychology. But, as I say, long time ago. How about something a bit more recent? We must have moved on from those views. Well, those ideas were still in circulation. Those negative views of women were still in circulation in psychology until quite recently among some. So here's what Dr. Glenn Wilson, fellow of the British Psychological Society, was saying in the 1990s. He said that 95% of bank managers, company directors, judges and university professors in Britain were men because men were more competitive, and dominance is a personality characteristic determined by male hormones. He said women in academic jobs are less productive than men, and objectively speaking, women may have already been over-promoted in those jobs. And he also said that women who do have successful careers largely do so because their brains have become masculinized. Here are a couple more for you. Professor Richard Lin, psychologist, he believed, and believes still, I think, I don't know, men are more intelligent than women. Last time I saw him say this was in 2010. And Paul Irwin, Richard Lin's colleague, also a psychologist, he said the same thing in 2005. That men achieve more because they're more intelligent than women. Sue Wilkinson has cited those examples and other examples of how psychology has been asserting that women are inferior to men, and that's been used to justify women's exclusion from or limited achievements within education and professions. Well, I'm still quoting stuff that's a couple of decades old. It's still a while, and things have changed, haven't they? Things have moved on. We've had the Me Too movement. Surely things can't be like that now. Well, that's why we're bringing in one of our two prominent psychologists into this unit in a couple of weeks, Jordan Peterson, who's going to be a focus for us in week 8.
Personally, I'm very happy about it.
But just a little snippet for you, just to show what's coming.
I think we lie to 18 to 19-year-old women non-stop, especially in universities and educational institutions.
That's a minute, by the way, sorry.
By telling them that career is going to be the fundamental purpose, give the fundamental purpose to their life.
So Jordan Peterson has talked about how he believes women should not be going to university and getting a career. He doesn't think that will make you happy if you're a woman. Making a home and looking after your husband and your kids. He's quite heteronormative. He thinks that you should be in an opposite sex rather than a same-sex relationship. Among the things he said on record is that women shouldn't wear makeup at work. because it's signaling to men that they're sexually available. So there you see, those stereotypes in play that are informing prejudicial views that feed into potential discrimination, such as denying women places at university or access to professional careers, or even the choice of being able to wear makeup at work. Of course, Jordan Peterson's not the only psychologist who believes in these things, though there are fewer and fewer of these psychologists around these days, because it's quite hard working in a professional environment and being able to express these views, because you've got strict professional codes as well as broader legal frameworks that protect women against discriminatory practices. And we've got pieces of legislation and their expression in those professional codes and organizational workplace policies that are strengthening, becoming stronger and stronger, that have solidified women's rights. Certainly things are improving. So that might explain why you're getting fewer psychologists coming out with these views, because they can't remain in professional practice whilst expressing these views because of organizational policies and the broader legislative framework. But the view of women as inferior to men is actually quite deeply seated in psychology. You know, that legacy of those patriarchal views expressed about women by our founding fathers. You know, founding fathers, that's the clue there. You know, there's a legacy there. It's been longer lasting than you might imagine. And you see it in the volumes of fault finding about women. Research that shows women to be deficient compared to men in lots of areas. These include how women are argued as having lower self-esteem than men, being less self-confident than men, having more difficulty developing a separate sense of self than men, being more likely than men to say that they're hurt than to admit that they're angry. But let's just pause there for a second. First, these things are stereotypes dressed up as scientific observations. You know that now, yeah? They're snapshots that make broad generalization about women's behavior at a group level that may or may not have any truth to them. Certainly, you wouldn't be wanting to use this stuff to try and understand individual women. It's crazy. But the interesting thing is that psychology has tended to describe those things that I just listed as faults with women. But of course, that's a value judgment about those things, whether or not they're true. Still interesting about the values that sit behind those statements that, you know, women are inferior because of these things. Those things are just, they're not objectively bad. You know, they've just been ascribed as bad. So we could tweak it so that it says the same sort of thing, but with a positive spin, like a positive value judgment about those things that they're measuring. So we could say that women are less conceited than men, less likely to overvalue their work than men, have less difficulty forming and maintaining relationships than men, less likely to accuse and attack others when they're unhappy than men. And also in that original way of putting things, can you see those cultural tropes coming through? Individualism, individual concept of self, how that sits behind bits of those statements. Yes, in there, in that bit that says women have more difficulty developing a separate sense of self than men. As though that's a fault, that's a weakness. But under a collectivist society, that would be a strength. So there are connections to those cultural domains and concept of self that we've been talking about previously. But here, what I'm making is a more particular point, that women have been described by psychology and seen by psychology for much of its history as not as good as men, even if those measures that it's used have been questionable. You know, the main message here is how psychology has seen women as inferior. Now, in Carol Tavra's book, The Mismeasure of Women, we hear this point about the way psychology has pathologized women expressed really well. That lots of psychological research on sex differences was designed to find out why women were not as good as men, why they were not like men, why they weren't as successful, why they weren't as intelligent, why they weren't as motivated, why they weren't as perceptive, and so on. It positioned women as inferior. Now, in the videos for week 8, I'll talk to you more about this stuff on gender as we talk about some of the things that Jordan Peterson has said. But we're also going to talk about sexuality, because this is another thing that psychology hasn't dealt with particularly well. So, till then, ta-da.